All right, I'm going to read from Logos Rising, A History of Ultimate Reality. Read from some of the introduction last time. I'm going to skip to chapter 5 and read through this chapter, which is entitled The Beginning of Christianity, John and the Logos. Previously, the chapter was entitled Paul and the Philosophers. It was really interesting. Goes into the history of Paul and his speaking in Greece. But I wanted to start at chapter 5 here, the beginning of Christianity. John and the Logos is the subsection. As a thought experiment, try to imagine what might have happened if Paul had begun his speech before the Areopagus by saying, "In the beginning there was Logos," the sentence which begins the Gospel of St. John. Both John and Paul were involved in trying to make the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ comprehensible to the Greco-Roman world. To do that, they had to explain not only what Jesus did, but who he was. Paul prepared the way for the reception of John's concept of the Logos into the world of Christian thought in his epistle to the Hebrews, when he described Christ as the quote, eternal high priest after the order of Melchizedek. A priest is by definition a human being. An eternal high priest is something else, but exactly what it is not clear. To make Christ's identity clear, John took the concept of Logos, which had been in existence for 500 years, and reworked it in light of what he knew about Jesus Christ to provide the vocabulary which brought one of the great cycles in human history to a close and a new era into being, based on the enhanced understanding of what went before. Paul criticized the vanity of the silversmiths and their apologists, but John took the gold and the silver out of Greece. The word logos was in every sense of that notoriously polyvalent word, that transition which did not abolish what went before, but rather raised it to a new, previously unattainable level. Who was Jesus Christ? To proclaim the gospel, the evangelists had to introduce the man they called the Messiah to their readers and explain why he was different from any other man who have walked on the face of the earth. Matthew gave a long Hebrew genealogy. Luke wrote the infancy narrative. But John proposed a metaphysical explanation of his relationship to the beginning of the universe and therefore God, that necessitated the use of the word logos. St. John provided a synthesis of the Hebrew and Greek traditions when he wrote, "En archai ineo logos," in the beginning, echoes the first sentence of Genesis, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." Instead of repeating what the author of Genesis has already said, John writes a second Genesis by taking Hebrew cosmology and joining it to Greek metaphysics when he says, quote, "In the beginning, there was Logos." As Clement of Alexandria formulated it, to the barbarians, God has given the law and the prophets. To the Hellenists, he has given philosophy, so that the ears of both might be prepared to hear the gospel. The fourth gospel describes Christ as the agent of creation who, quote, "is the Word who is God, equal to God, co-eternal with God. It is by him that the whole of the created order was brought into being." This book then is a new Genesis, a new creation. The same God who made the world by the agency of his Word, the Word which was truly God himself, God in action, God as agent, now comes into the world. He had created to make it afresh. The fourth gospel, therefore, is seen by its author to be a second Genesis, and is to be the account of a second creation. The second creation is to bring the created order back to God. End quote. In writing his gospel, John found himself face to face with the new problem: the personality of Jesus Christ and his relation to God on the one hand, and the finite world on the other. It was not enough to call him vaguely the Messiah or the Son of God or second Adam. His position in the cosmos required a more precise definition. The writings of the Stoics and Philo of Alexandria were full of premonitions that a synthesis was possible, but the problem remained. Once you assume the infinite transcendence and unknowableness of God as the absolute, you cannot bridge over the great gulf fixed between God and the world by any hypothesis consistent with monotheism. The only solution available to the classical world was the pantheistic monism of the Stoics, which allowed a logos idea, but at the expense of a clear relationship between God and creation. According to that monism, God was the universe, and the universe was God. The Stoics and the Neoplatonists took steps in the direction of a coherent worldview, but neither was successful in reaching the goal. Logos was an essential part of a law-ordered world, which became a remote perpetuatio evangelica, because the conception of a law-ordered world naturally leads to the conception of a lawgiver and orderer. Plato played a crucial role in this development by providing in his laws reasons why we should admit the existence of mind operative in the universe, that foreshadowed later natural theologies. Plato's pupil Aristotle took the idea of a cosmic nous and explained how this transcendent, immaterial thought would have to be of necessity the absolute final cause of the universe. When later thinkers placed the Platonic forms within the mind of God, a certain syncretism of Platonism and Aristotelianism took place, bringing together the ultimate efficient, exemplary, and final causes into a conception of reality that made it easier than it might otherwise have been to accept Christianity from the intellectual standpoint. Stoicism contributed a noble ethic, which joined the unmoved mover with its doctrine of immanent logos and its providential operation in the world. When combined with the thought of Aristotle, Plato paved the way for the ultimate acceptance of the one transcendent immanent God. Because it was a historical religion, Christianity based these claims on historical fact and not myth. The Logos, John would claim in the prologue to his gospel, wasn't just a theoretical principle, although it was certainly that as well. The Logos was made flesh. He lived among us. The bulk of John's gospel is historical, but the prologue to the gospel is ontological and metaphysical. If Paul based his ministry on proclaiming what Jesus did, John based his on explaining who Jesus was by providing a metaphysical prologue. If Matthew provided Christ's human genealogy, John provided his metaphysical genealogy. Aquinas says that John began his gospel on a loftier plane than the other evangelists who announced Christ, the Son of God, born in time, whereas John presents him existing from eternity. If Paul based his ministry on proclaiming what Jesus did, John based his on explaining who Jesus was by providing a metaphysical prologue. If Matthew provided Christ's human genealogy, John provided his metaphysical genealogy. Aquinas says that John began his gospel on a loftier plane than the other evangelists who announced Christ, the Son of God, born in time, whereas John presents him existing from eternity. When he wrote, "In the beginning was the Word," Matthew, Mark, and Luke show him suddenly appearing among men, but John claims that Jesus always existed with the Father when he wrote, "And the Word was with God." Matthew, Mark, and Luke show him as a man, but John says that he is God, and the Word was God. In his commentary on the first two sentences of the prologue to St. John's Gospel, St. Thomas Aquinas claims the author's principal object is to show the divinity of the incarnate Word. John does this metaphysically in describing the Word's relation in the Trinity, and then historically by describing the actions which the Word incarnate performed on earth. Next section is the era of peace comes to an end. Christ was born when the entire world was at peace, but at the age of John and Paul lacked the otium liberale, which is the sine qua non of philosophical investigation. The era of peace came to an abrupt end on July 19th, 64 AD, when, according to some accounts, agents of the Emperor Nero, then residing in his villa in Antinum south of Otia, set Rome ablaze. The fire raged for 7 days, destroying 10 of the city's 14 districts before it died down. To quell reports that his henchmen had set the blaze, Nero had to find a scapegoat to divert attention from his own malfeasance. The logical choice was the Jews, a group which at that time included the mostly Jewish Christian sect. But by the time of the Great Fire, Poppaea had gone from being Nero's mistress to being his wife. Attuned to the needs of the Jews who wanted to distance themselves from the hated new sect, Poppaea persuaded Nero to pin the blame on the Christians. Added by Poppaea, quote, The Jews were able to withdraw their own heads from the imperial noose and direct the anti-Semitic feeling of the populace against the Christians. Until this time, Christianity had flourished under the protecting roof of the synagogue, but now an enormous price was exacted for that benefit. The full hatred of the Roman people against the Jews was now unloaded on the Christians. Influential persons close to Nero, Tigel, Linus, Alterius, and the Jewish proselyte Poppaea, incited the emperor against the followers of Christ, and thus the church was caught between the upper and nether millstones of Judaism and anti-Semitism. The wonder is that the church was not ground out of existence." End quote. A terrible persecution followed. Christians were dragged into the Colosseum to reenact scenes from Greek mythology. Suetonius describes Christians being burned to death, depicting Hercules in flames, or being pulled limb from limb on the rack of Ixion, or devoured by bears like Orpheus, or being raped like Pasiphae by Nero wearing the head of a bull. Seneca, who had seen many gladiators die in the arena, claimed that in the midst of all these tortures, there was one who did not moan. No, he did not beg for his life. No, I saw more, he smiled, as though there was happiness in his heart. Instead of seeing in the martyr's witness a power which alone could have kept Rome alive, the sadistic emperor and the lust and violence besetted mob who attended his grisly spectacles put their faith in the old state religion, which could no longer provide the universal spiritual bond the empire needed to survive, because that obsolete state religion had completely discredited by the derision and contempt of Rome's philosophers. Paul and John suffered persecution for their efforts. According to Tertullian, John was banished from Rome after miraculously surviving death when he was plunged into burning oil. John may have been exiled to the Isle of Patmos, where he wrote the Apocalypse, but his initial destination was probably in the city of Asia Minor, where he wrote his Gospel. After being told to take care of Mary, the mother of Christ, while standing at the foot of the cross, John took her to Ephesus, where she was assumed bodily into heaven. Justin Martyr, who came to Ephesus to find a Platonic tutor and ended up converting to Christianity, substantiates the claim that John lived in Ephesus in the dialogue with Trypho. Irenaeus locates John there too, claiming in his book on heretics that John wrote his gospel in Ephesus. He also claims that Saint Polycarp became John's pupil in Ephesus before becoming bishop of neighboring Smyrna, where he suffered a martyr's death. When Paul arrived in Asia Minor on his second missionary journey, the Holy Spirit did not allow him to proclaim the gospel there, presumably because John had arrived before him, and Paul was only commissioned to preach in virgin territory. John, therefore, would have been aware of Paul's struggles in proclaiming the gospel. If so, John would have shared Paul's animus against the Jews and sympathized with his difficulty in bringing the same gospel to the Gentiles, leading us to believe that John wrote his gospel in Ephesus after Paul's death in 67, probably with Paul's shortcomings in mind. To provide the metaphysical foundation lacking in Paul's address to the Areopagus, John had to invoke the most fundamental concept of Greek philosophy, namely the idea of logos. The term logos originated with Heraclitus as a way of resolving the difficulties which inevitably followed when the early Ionian thinkers prescribed something material as the fundamental building block of the universe, as Thales did with water and Anaximenes did with air. Most histories of philosophy lump Heraclitus with the other materialistic physiology, but Heraclitus seems to have despised them because they lack sufficient powers of abstraction. Both Aristotle and Plato associated Heraclitus with the spurious claims that everything flows, pantare, as a way of turning him into the opposite of Parmenides, who claimed that being simply was, and that therefore nothing changed. Being, according to Parmenides, cannot arise from non-being. If that which is cannot come from that which is not, then it must come from that which already is, which means that it already exists, which means that it did not come into being after all, and that being suffers no change. We have unfortunately no way of knowing whether Heraclitus was reacting to Parmenides or vice versa. Either way, quote, we see the intellectual power and comprehensive mind of Heraclitus or Parmenides struggling with the crippling poverty of philosophic language as we trace the development of two of the greatest philosophies of the world has ever seen. The philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, as we see the broadening influence of the Stoic school, had witnessed the evolution of the final creative effort of ancient thought, the system of Platonic Neoplatonism. We cannot but acknowledge that we have before us one of the supreme achievements of the human race." End quote. Supreme as this achievement was, it was not without problems. Plato and Aristotle agreed that God was an unmoved mover. Plato, however, argued that the soul is a self-moving source of motion in humans and animals. He also felt that divine souls supply the motions of the heavenly bodies and thus govern the universe. He thus proposed the principle of efficient causality for the universe. What Plato doesn't explain in this relationship between the divine souls and the first mover. Aristotle, on the other hand, transforms Plato's argument for the soul as a self-moving source of motion into an argument for an unmoved first mover. Plato's one or several divine souls are thus replaced by the one or several unmoved movers of the heavenly bodies. To be God, Aristotle's God must be unmoved. If he were not unmoved, he could not be the first mover. However, if there is no motion in God, then his relationship to creation, which is full of motion, becomes unclear. If that which is cannot come from that which is not, where did the motion in the sublunary sphere come from? To answer the question, Plato posited the demiurge, who is etymologically a worker for the people, but theologically a theologomenon, which is to say a hypothetical entity drawn from previous philosophical premises. Plato says in the Philebus that all the wise agree that Nous is king for us of heaven and earth, and this Nous is identical with the demiurge. Plato's God is immaterial and immanent. His God is, as a result, psychologically satisfying in a way that Aristotle's is not. As Nous, or mind, it rules heaven and earth like a king. However, because it is identical with the demiurge, it is not transcendent. So to be transcendent, Aristotle's God loses his ability to affect the created world. But to be effective, Plato must become the demiurge, which means that he is no longer the transcendent God. The atheist's dilemma of a later era also applies to the Greek concept of God. God could be good or powerful, but he couldn't be both at the same time. Neither Plato nor Aristotle, in other words, could bridge the gap between the transcendent God and the immanent, changeable universe. Unlike the unphilosophical Hebrews, whose scriptures began with the claim that, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Greeks did not have a clear idea of the universe as something created in time. The Aristotelian God works as ultimate final cause. But since the philosopher did not see how God's changelessness and self-sufficiency could be reconciled with the exercise of efficient causality, he neglected to provide an ultimate efficient cause. He thought no doubt that the exercise of final causality by the unmoved mover was also the ultimate efficient causality that was requisite. But this meant that for Aristotle, the world was not only eternal, but also ontologically independent of God. The unmoved mover could scarcely be regarded as drawing the world into existence through the unconscious exercise of final authority. If the world were ontologically independent of God, how did it come into being? Saying that the world was eternal did not solve this problem, because everything which exists has to come into being. The eternality of the world, which is another way of describing the Greeks' difficulty in understanding creation, confused time with causality and created a massive roadblock across the development of Greek philosophy. Plato tried to circumvent that problem with the demiurge, but this returned philosophy to the problem of infinite regress, a problem which Aristotle had solved in his Metaphysics when he wrote that there can be no infinite regress in the production of things from their materials, as flesh from earth, earth from air, air from fire, and so ad infinitum. For in the infinite series here described, and in infinities generally, all the parts down to the one before us are similarly made, middle terms. And hence, when there is no first term, there is no explanation at all. End quote. Aristotle's unmoved mover did justice to both being and becoming by providing a principle of both stability and change. As the ultimate final cause in the universe, Aristotle's unmoved mover was by definition God, and as such, he or it also served as a unifying and harmonizing principle, drawing the multiplicity of phenomenon into an intelligible unity. Aristotle seemed content to leave the unmoved mover alone in his sphere of self-contained thought. Plato, on the other hand, was determined to involve God in the world, and so his followers posited a demiurge as the being who created the world of time and space while leaving God alone in complete transcendence. Plato proposed a world of forms which existed outside of God, but where he could not say, nor could he say whether the forms were eternal and coexistent with God. This caused Aristotle to reject Platonic exemplarism, but in rejecting it was forced to insist on final causality to the apparent exclusion of cosmic efficient causality, leading to an ultimate dualism between God and an independent world. There was no way to reconcile these systems. In spite of their great achievement, Plato and Aristotle left their philosophies in an unresolved state at their deaths. With the death of Aristotle, Greek philosophy went into a state of decline before it was able to resolve its own internal self-contradictions. John's prologue solved the problem of incoherence which had plagued Greek philosophy because the Logos incarnate, or the second person of the Trinity, brought together the God of Aristotle, self-subsistent being, with Plato's forms, which became ideas in the mind of God, the Logos, which became an ultimate efficient cause, the role previously assigned, but not in any ultimate sense, to the demiurge. Eventually, all of the roles would get assigned to different persons of the Trinity. In the Christian philosophy, which got hammered out of the centuries following John's prologue, the ultimate efficient, exemplary, and final causes are explicitly identified in one spiritual God, supreme being and reality, and the source of all created independent being. St. John began his gospel by making a number of metaphysical claims. Next section is entitled, "In the beginning there was Logos." In both Greek philosophy and Christian theology, Logos refers to the divine reason implicit in the cosmos, ordering it and giving it form and meaning. The word Logos takes up 5 columns of English equivalents in Liddell and Scott's Greek-English lexicon. The word Logos goes back as far as Homer, where it means collecting, as when Achilles says, "Let us gather, legomen, the bones of Patroclus," as well as telling tales, or logi. From there, the word's meaning expanded under Heraclitus until St. John appropriated it as the term best describing God the Son. Etymologically, the word refers to collecting and laying down, tale-telling and relating, counting and accounting, account-giving, arguing, and so speaking, saying, and above all, the thinking, the reasoning that is behind uttering, and finally also writing. At its most basic, Logos refers back to the verb legen, which means to pick up and lay down or lay by, that is, to collect, hence to count up, to tell, as does a blank bank teller, to recount, as in a tale, and thus to give an account. It's related to the Latin term ratio, which means reason, but it is also related to the same word in English, ratio, which means not only numerical relations, but same word in English, but also addressing something as a way of entering into a relation with it, or someone as a way of entering into a relation with him or her. The first chapter of the Gospel according to John, Jesus Christ is identified as the Word made flesh in a way consonant with the Jewish concept of wisdom, as the divine agent that draws man to God, in a way that would be comprehensible to readers in the Hellenistic world. John interprets the Logos as inseparable from the person of Jesus, and it does not simply imply that the Logos is the revelation that Jesus proclaims. St. John got his idea of Logos not directly from Heraclitus, but from the Stoics, who defined the Logos as an active, rational, and spiritual principle that permeated all reality. They called the Logos providence, nature, God, and the soul of the universe, which is composed by many seminal logi that are contained in the universal Logos. The Stoics associated Logos with Zeus as world manager, but most importantly with fire. Zeus was fire, and the Logos was fire. Heraclitus' Logos is a remote precursor to the Christian use. In the Gospel of St. John, because the Logos brings terms into relations to each other, particularly in the ratio relationship that connects two terms in mutually determining juxtaposition, especially in respect to their common measurability, Logos names a relation of magnitudes. Origen says that Christ is called the Logos because, quote, "He takes away from us all that is irrational and makes us truly reasonable so that we do all things, even to eating and drinking, to the glory of God, and discharge by the Logos to the glory of God both the commoner functions of life and those which belong to a more advanced stage. For if by having part in him we are raised up and enlightened, herded, also it may be, and ruled over, then it is clear that we become in a divine manner reasonable, when he drives away from us what is irrational and dead, since he is Logos, reason, and the resurrection." End quote. Aquinas gave definitive expression to the dilemma which John resolved by incorporating Heraclitus' concept of Logos into the Trinity, but he did it so in Latin, depriving his readers of the etymological richness of the Greek term. In writing his commentary on John's Gospel, St. Thomas Aquinas simply translates the original Greek into the Latin sentence in principio erat verbum, which is every bit as enigmatic as the English translation, because both have been shorn of the association which make the original Greek so pregnant with meaning. The word logos is traditionally translated as the equivalent of the English word in virtually every translation of the Gospel, the exception being Chinese, which translates logos as Tao, or the way. Because he wrote in Greek, Origen retained the etymological richness of the term logos in a way that Aquinas does not. According to Origen, quote, "Life came into being in the logos, so the logos in the archai. Consider, however, if we are at liberty to take this meaning of archai for our text, in the beginning was the Word, so as to obtain the meaning that all things came into being according to wisdom and according to the models of the system which are present in his thoughts. For I consider that as a house or a ship is built and fashioned in accordance with the sketches of the builder or designer, the house or the ship having their beginning, archai, and the sketches and reckonings in his mind, so all things come down by God in wisdom. And we should add that having created, so to speak, and sold wisdom, he left her to hand over from the types which were in her to things existing and to matter, the actual emergence of them, their molding and their forms. But I consider, if it be permitted, to say this, that the beginning, archai, of real existence was the Son of God, saying, Revelation 22:13, I am the beginning and end, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. We must, however, remember that he is not the archai in respect of every name which is applied to him. For how can he be the beginning in respect of his being life, when life came in by the Word, and the Word is manifestly the archai of life? It is also tolerably evident that he cannot be the archai in respect of his being the firstborn from the dead. And if we go through all his titles carefully, we find that he is the archai only in respect of his being wisdom, not even as the Word, as he, the archai, for the Word was in the archai. And so one might venture to say that wisdom is anterior to all the thoughts that are expressed in the titles of the firstborn of every creature. Origen, and that's the end of the quote. Origen slips into heresy when he claims that the Holy Spirit is the most excellent and the first in order, and of all that is made by the Father through Christ. Aquinas denounced Origen as a heretic, but the latter's commentary on the Gospel of John preserves the proliferation of meanings implicit in the Greek term. In his reading of the prologue of the Gospel of St. John, Origen describes Christ as the demiurge, as a beginning archai, inasmuch as he is wisdom. It is in virtue of his being wisdom that he is called archai. For wisdom says in Solomon Proverbs 8:22, God created me the beginning of his ways for his works, so that the Word might be in an archai, namely in wisdom. Logos is not only what men share in their rational nature, it is also what God and man share. It is the only thing God and man have in common. Therefore, Logos was a natural intermediary, and as such, seen early on as the solution to the philosophical problems peculiar to the gods of Aristotle and Plato. Philo of Alexandria, a 1st century AD Jewish philosopher, claimed that the Logos was the intermediary between God and the cosmos, being both the agent of creation and the agent through which human mind can apprehend and comprehend God. According to Philo, the Logos was both immanent in the world and at the same time transcendent, and the transcendent divine mind. Philo of Alexandria tried to adapt Greek philosophy and Greek language as a suitable vehicle for Jewish ideas. Thus, the school of Alexandria furthered the plans of providence by making Greek the classic form of expression for Christian dogma. Philo's Logos is, quote, not simply the uttered word or command of God. It is the meaning, plan, or purpose of the universe, conceived as transcendent as well as immanent, as the thought of God formed within the eternal mind and projected into objectivity. From the human point of view, it is a rational content of thought expressed in the order of the universe, but it is this not, as with the Stoics, in the sense that the order of the universe is self-originated, self-contained, and self-explanatory, but in the sense that its order and meaning express the mind of a transcendent creator. End quote. Dodd claims that the substance of Philo's logo doctrine is present all through the Gospel of St. John, but especially in the prologue where the term is used. However, Dodd overstates his case when he claims that Philo felt that the Logos is God himself as revealed. If Philo had proclaimed that, he would no longer have been a Jew. Instead, Philo reduced the Logos to an agency of God and posited it as a hypothetical philosophical concept rather than a divine person, which was the claim that John made when he said that the Logos is God, something a Jew would have seen as blasphemous. God, understood as Yahweh, was, according to Philo, both personal, as Jewish theology had always taught, but also pure being, absolutely simple, free and self-sufficient. But Logos, in Philo's view, was not God. Logos was definitely inferior to God and is therefore not identical with the dogma of the Logos as maintained in Christian theology, even if it influenced early Christian thinkers. Sometimes, indeed, the Logos seems to be conceived as an aspect of God. Judaism would prove an insurmountable object, blocking the way to a sophisticated understanding of the new and expanded meaning of Logos. The Jewish religion had much in common with the Greek philosophy because both were stress on the divine transcendence, prohibited direct contact with matter. As a result, the concept of God, which Philo derived from Hebrew and Greek sources, the Philonic philosophy could never admit the Christian doctrine of the incarnation. As a result, Philo identified the Logos with angelic theophanies on the one hand and an incorporeal substance, the immaterial word or voice of God, which was conceived as really distinct from God, as well as a subordinate to God and as God's instrument on the other. The Philonic Logos is a subordinate and intermediary being through which God expresses himself and acts. According to Philo, the Logos is Plato's demiurge, and as such, not the ultimate efficient cause that was needed to reconcile heaven and earth. Philo's attempt to reconcile Judaism and Greek philosophy failed because he tried to graft his understanding of Logos onto an obsolete understanding of God. He tried to put the new wine of Logos into the old skins of Hebrew and Greek theology, which could not contain it without exploding. Logos is what rational creatures have in common. So just as Logos in its original sense unites men because it is what they share, so Logos in the expanded sense unites God and man in the person of Jesus Christ, the Logos incarnate, true God and true man, and the second person of the Trinity. John's first task is to introduce Jesus Christ, but to do that, he has to explain who Christ is. And to do that, he has to explain Christ's relationship with God, which means that he has to explain the Trinity. He does this in the second proposition. So I think I'll stop there from now. The next, actually I'll read through this it's a page and a half. So the next section is the Logos was with God and the Logos was God. John continues his explication of the Logos when he writes, quote, "The Word was with God and the Word was God," end quote. Origen says that the Logos was God, first of all, because the Word was with God. And here's a quote from Origen. "The Word was always with the Father, and so it is said, and the Word was with God. He did not come to God, and this same word was used of the Word because he was in the beginning at the same time when he was with God, neither being separated from the beginning nor being bereft of his Father. And again, neither did he come to be in the beginning after he had not been in it, nor did he come to be with God after not having been with him. For before all time and the remotest age, the Word was in the beginning, and the Word was with God. Thus, to find out what is meant by the phrase, the Word is with God, we have adduced the words used about the prophets, how he came to Hosea, to Isaiah, to Jeremiah, and we have noticed the difference, by no means accidental, between became and was," end quote. By saying that Logos was with God, John took the first step towards adumbrating the Trinity. Without positing that claim, the following sentence, "and Logos is God," would have been understood in some pantheistic sense. The Trinity precludes any such misunderstanding of God's nature. According to Aquinas' reading of the prologue, the preposition "with" signifies the distinction of the Word, which is said to be with God. And although this preposition signifies a distinction in person, it does not signify a distinction in nature, since the nature of the Father and of the Son is the same. Consequently, the evangelist wished to signify the person of the Father, which he said, God. This means that the Word is both God and distinct, which implies two persons, distinct but identical in being. The Logos was both God by nature while simultaneously a distinct person, specifically the second person of the Trinity. This is what John meant when he said the Word was with God and the Word was God. The term "with God" signifies a distinction in person but not in nature. This distinction eluded Philo, who could not conceive of different persons in God sharing the same nature. John then tells us that through him all things came to be. This is the first mention of the dynamism, which will be John's unique contribution to metaphysical thought. Being, we learn, is essentially active or diffusive of itself. But just as the Logos is both God and with God, being and agency are preserved distinct as Father and Son. Because, according to Aquinas, quote, "Whoever makes something must preconceive it in his wisdom, which is the form and pattern of the thing made, as the form preconceived in the mind of an artisan is the pattern of the cabinet to be made. So God makes nothing except through the conception of his intellect, which is an eternally conceived wisdom, that is, the Word of God and the Son of God. Accordingly, it is impossible that he should make anything except through the Son. And so Augustine says, in the Trinity, that the Word is the art full of the living patterns of all things. Thus it is clear that all things which the Father makes, he makes through him. So after he had said, all things were made through him, namely, those that Moses listed, the evangelist then added, and without him nothing was made, as though he were saying, none of the things which exist, whether visible or invisible, were made without the Word." End quote. Plagued by the inability to explain the ultimate efficient cause, Greek philosophy degenerated into the magic which Paul condemned in Ephesus. St. John broke this philosophical logjam by claiming that the ultimate efficient cause was a person, in fact, the divine person who is the second person of the Trinity. According to Aquinas, John makes it his principal object to show the divinity of the incarnate Word. Although it was probably not his intention, John also solved the problem of the philosophers as a necessary consequence of explaining the doctrine of the Trinity. In resolving the question about the relationship of God the Father to God the Son, John resolved the unanswered questions that had plagued philosophy since the death of Aristotle. Aquinas says that John resolved the causality issue when he wrote, "He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things came to be." The concept of Logos, as first articulated by Heraclitus, allowed John to reconfigure Plato's forms as ideas and then place them in the mind of a person who could act. God was now Logos in motion, which meant that Logos wasn't just a plan. Logos was a person who had the power to put that plan into action. That plan was no longer abstract geometry or rationality. It now encompassed all of human history. The Logos was now the plan of rationality and the power bringing that rationality into actual being throughout the course of history. God was suddenly dynamic in a way that solved the conundrum which had puzzled Greek thinkers for centuries. So I'll stop there. There's next few sections. The Logos was made flesh. God is love. And the chapter goes on from there. So thanks for listening.